Welcome to this Beyond the Abstracts conversation with Dominic Edsall. Dominic, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Thanks for coming. And before we kind of jump into the conversation, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm currently an assistant professor at KPUM, which is Kyoto Prefectural University of Medicine, teaching English to the undergraduates mainly, some graduate students. I'm from the UK originally. A long time ago, I actually started out as a chemistry teacher. Then I retrained in TESOL, and I recently completed a PhD actually in education specifically rather than TESOLs. I've been teaching in my current post for about 2 years. I'm actually moving to a new post in a new department within the same university next month.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I've taught at various universities in Japan, and I've also taught at primary schools in Japan as well, like as private schools. And I also currently teach some pedagogy classes at another university as well. So teaching students who want to be teachers.
Okay, all right. Thanks for that. So you mentioned that you're from the UK originally, like me, and as we started this conversation, we were talking about the difficulties of transcription software picking up on our accents, and for me, that's because I think I've lived in Japan for about 15 years, and so my accent is now all over the place because of these different influences that I've had on it. Is that something that you've noticed too?
Well, I found I was usually when you meet people from the UK, that you can place people usually, right? People tend to place me in entirely a different area of the UK from where I mostly grew up because, I moved around a lot as a kid, so my accent's kind of moved around quite a bit, and it definitely doesn't sound very Yorkshire. So it throws people off sometimes. But I couldn't place your accent either. So transcript should be interesting.
So what was it that drew you to Japan, if I can ask?
Well, actually, as I mentioned, I was a chemistry teacher, and I was working in an inner city school in Walthamstow, which a Canadian teacher described the students as making up for what they lack in firepower with enthusiasm.
That's nice.
It was it was kind of place that had 2-meter fences, security guards, security cameras everywhere. I got paid extra to teach there.
Okay.
And I did reasonably well. We went from a 20% pass rate in science GCSE to 100% pass rate.
Okay.
So we did really well, but I just burnt out, and I decided to take a break, and I thought, okay, well, at the time, schools wanted to have people who could teach English and another subject at the same time, EFL as another subject, because inner city schools, lots of immigrant children coming in, speaking lots of different languages. I think in our school we had something like 17 different languages, so it was pretty diverse. And I thought, okay, I saw an advert to go teach in Japan for a year, and I thought, okay, that would be an experience. I could kind of chill out for a bit, recover, learn some skills, come back, find a better job.
Okay.
And 1 year became 2 years, became 3 years.
That part of your story, at least, is familiar to me.
Yeah, I think it's a pretty common story for a lot of English teachers
Mm.
in Japan. And yeah, I've kind of come and gone because I went back to the UK to retrain to take a master's in TESOL. And I think, yeah, in total, more than 10 years. I've spent more than 10 years in Japan. So maybe not as much as you, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So with that, the school you mentioned in Walthamstow, where you started
Yeah.
off, was that secondary or primary? Did you mention?
It was secondary, but it was a weird one. It was it 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 had been a middle school a long time when it was
Okay.
originally built, and so it was a secondary school, but everything was smaller. So you know how primary schools, the ergonomics of the building are actually designed for your small kids.
Mm.
It was a bit like having a secondary school. So you had the chemistry lab and everything, but everything is lower and smaller. And it was it was quite a small school. There was only 300 students, which is quite
Interesting.
small
Mm.
for London schools. But it had a lot of problems, a lot of teacher turnover,
Okay.
student issues. You know, um, I I would say I was quite good at classroom management because I had a kind of baptism by fire experience. Um, I remember being pulled in by the deputy head one day. Said, "You speak French, right?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I have a GCSE in it." Okay, you're going to cover the French teacher today because so and so's student has thrown a desk at him, and but I had really good co-workers in the science department, and we had we had a really nice team, a really good boss, and it really kind of came together. It was okay to work there for the time that I did, but eventually people started moving on, and
Mm.
it gets more difficult. You can't really teach in that type of school unless you have a really strong team, and a lot of it depends on personalities. So
Mm.
one person move, yeah. So yeah, um, so it was weird because I was a new teacher at that time, but in a lot of ways, the I had I had better classroom management than some. Particularly, agency teachers who are kind of cycling through. They're
That's
there
hard.
for they're there for a term and then they're going somewhere else, or and I got to know a lot of the students, and a lot of the students were, you kind of a lot of them are acting out because they're being challenged by a frightening environment, and it's all kind of
Mm-hmm.
building up. And
So was
so
this for GCSE?
yeah, so this was all key stage. Well, so it's year 7 to GCSE. So it's
Okay.
all, yeah.
So for
But
anyone that's not familiar with the UK system, that means the full range of secondary school, of compulsory education,
yeah,
like ages
yeah.
up until
So
16.
yeah, but yeah, we used to uh, yeah, we it was. If anybody has seen what is it? There's one of the Educating East. There's a TV series called Educating London or Educating something that was actually filmed in the school that became the successor to my
Okay.
previous school.
Oh,
So I used to work with some of the teachers who were in that TV series and
awesome.
stuff. Um, and I can recognize a lot of the same problems. Came to Japan. Japanese students are a complete pushover. Even the most horrendously badly behaved are really nice in comparison.
I hope that you've never had a chair thrown at you at all.
Uh, yeah, well, you tend to preempt that right? Like you take a very kind of medieval approach of like narrowing the distance. So by the time they've got the chair to their head height, you're up in their face and you're like, oh, I'll take that chair. Thank you very much. And you're always polite, always
So,
nice.
when was it that you were also drafted in to teach English at that time, if I understood correctly? So you were teaching science all
You
ranges?
pretty much, this was kind of around, like at that point there was a lot of, there was still like CLIL was very much a new thing, but there was definitely like a let's be honest, they were trying to save money. They knew they had to support these students who couldn't speak English, who were coming into year 7 at 11 years old and couldn't really participate in the class. So they really want, and this was an age when you had to differentiate your class for different inclusion of students with different specific needs. And that was a point when they said, they were like, well, we really need you to kind of support this student or with their English. So as a teacher, you're trying to, you're trying to kind of put together, CLIL is kind of, it's difficult, right? Like you're trying to balance both the English input and your content, in my case, science. But in a lot of ways, it helped because I had to, pre-teaching of vocabulary was useful for the native English students anyway. So, it wasn't so bad. But we got to a point where there were massive behavior issues and staff issues, and I decided that I was going to quit, and it was just, I'd taken too much out of it. And at that point, weighing up my options, I thought, well, okay, take a break. I'm not a rich person. I can't afford to take a break for a huge amount of time. So, and I saw a job for in Japan teaching English. So I thought,
okay,
got
it.
Yeah.
So you had been teaching chemistry. I assume that's what you studied as an undergraduate as well.
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of get a picture of you and your kind of learning journey that you've gone on as well. So were there any key moments in there that kind of fed forward into these kind of career choices that you made later on?
Well, a lot of them are kind of a lot of them entirely accidental.
Okay.
Yeah. So I went to Imperial College London and to study chemistry, and I came from a very, very average rural secondary school. So Malton, where I was growing up at the time, was kind of, you were either part of the farming community or you were part of the community that's related commercial services, right? So the meat factory, and I didn't really sit anywhere in those. I don't sound like I'm from Yorkshire. You can imagine that kind of experience. And so learning kind of became a kind of way out. Okay. And that was pretty much like the sixth form, the A-level group. So the group who had decided they were going to go to university, they were all very much like, we've got to get out of here. You're teenagers, you kind of want to strive and get out. And I got to Imperial College, and I understand it now, but I had a feeling of definite imposter syndrome. You go from being surrounded by people celebrating that they got their, I don't know, some kind of farming certification and having huge drunken parties, to people who are extremely clever and they know a lot about the subject. And you know, and not only to the subject, but also like their hobbies and their, you know, it's kind of like suddenly being dumped into a Star Trek convention. They really, really, really know what their particular hobby or their particular focus. So yeah, I kind of, if you know, you know, in student dorms, in student halls, I'm living next door to somebody who's went to Eton and somebody who's, you know, playing the cello every 5 minutes, and other people, the rugby club people, and I felt, you know, it's a definite, feels like an imposter syndrome, like a question of like, why am I here? And I kind of, yeah, neglected a lot of, I should have studied harder. But I got into what they called, it was a program called the Pimlico Connection. And you would volunteer as a TA at Pimlico Secondary School. And I did that and I really enjoyed it. And then when it came to graduating, I realized, well, why don't I do a PGCE to go into science teaching? So I did a PGCE at the Institute of Education in London.
Okay.
Yeah. And I met a really good professor at that point, guy called, he's retired now, but it's a guy called Ralph Levinson. And you know, teacher trainer. I really, really enjoyed the PGC there. You learned a lot. It went very quickly, but you learned a lot. You spent a very long time doing in schools, doing training, and you got also educational sides of it. So that kind of, yeah, I went into teaching after that, and later when I was retraining, Ralph Levinson came up again. He suddenly remembered me from like 10 years later, or more than 10 years actually. So when I was applying for my MA, they were like, "Oh yeah, we're going to remember you." And it's like, wasn't maybe a good thing, maybe a bad thing. I don't know. But he was kind of a really memorable kind of teacher and advisor for my initial teaching and stuff. So it also helped that my mother's family, my mother was a teacher, my grandmother and grandfather had been teachers, so it was kind of
family trade.
Yeah, a little bit. So
do you think any of these early experiences have impacted your research work? We're talking because you know, this conversation is going to go on my language learner autonomy portal. So that's the theme here, which is I'm interested in, is there some connection there between those early experiences of yours and what you became interested in?
I think something, you know, these experiences, I kind of realized that particularly with the students I was interacting with, that there was always you know, people will say there's two sides, but it's not. It's more than that. There are more people have more than one or two sides to them. They have different roles that they're playing, and as I got to one of the things about my induction year, so the first year of teaching, I got to know the students. We had a small school, and you discover that you know, this student that maybe has been caricatured as being dumb or stupid or misbehaving is not. They're in other areas, they may be focusing more, they're learning more. You know, I can remember a physics lesson where well, it's science, but we were doing some physics in the science lesson, and the students are just not interested. But then if you start giving your example of like, momentum of a skateboard rider, and things like that, and you can, energy transfer when skateboarder hits the deck and things like that, and just getting to know the students. Like, obviously that doesn't work with all students, but if you know that in your class you've got a group who are more interested in that, you can do that. I'm sorry, where was I? So there it was, where I was very much getting to know that the students had a lot of complexity to them, that there were students who most of the students really wanted to do very, very well in their GCSEs, because they knew that their options after that were either expanded or reduced by their GCSEs. So their exams at the end of secondary school. And, even the ones who were not interested in continuing in further education or higher education, they knew they needed a minimum grade to get into trading, like learning a trade, or, if you wanted to be a plumber, you had to have a certain minimum English, certain minimum math level. And so in a way, it was like the students seemed to have a lot of autonomy and agency directed only in the way they wanted to go. But it wasn't, and a lot of the time that was kept hidden. They kind of, we're talking about inner city schools, so they're most tough street kids are not tough street kids. They just look like tough street kids, right? If I always think of, like, we're in Japan, so I always think about puffer fish. They look like they're really big, evil predators. They're not really. They just kind of run around scavenging.
Nice analogy.
Yeah, well, I don't know if the kids would like that analogy, but anyway. But you get, and a lot of the, so the students who wanted to study did study, but they wouldn't necessarily want to be seen to study. So weirdly, like the behavior support unit, where the school counselor was, and where the students who are really disrupting a class would go, was often, if it looked like a study or a self-access center all the time, because the students in there, they usually had a problem with somebody else in the class, or sometimes the teacher which is never good, but they would be getting on with actual study and work. And a lot of the times that students who would be labeled as non-academic actually had the ability to do it. And I could see that that it was a lot of the teachers were in a lot of ways kind of they trying to organize and control students, and in the process of were categorizing and labeling, and unfortunately that kind of it misrepresented their abilities and level of autonomy. And then I come to Japan and I get told, oh, these students, Japanese students have no autonomy, they do whatever the teacher says, and yet you can see examples of bad behavior, examples of students who basically ignoring the teachers, these robotic salarymen, suddenly they're going off to, I don't know, like one guy I knew who went off to play in his cross-dressing punk rock band at weekends, changing in the staff toilets into his costume late at night on the Friday, and then disappearing off to go play at this club in Osaka. You've got, and there's a kind of scientific point of view, right? I'm thinking, well, that doesn't fit the pattern, right? This claim of homogeneity is just not true. There's something more complex going on there. And I started researching in motivation, and I realized that that's very much like a fluid. It's a moving target, right? You can probably get a good idea from a Likert scale test or something, some kind of survey of their motivation at this particular point. But then 5 minutes later, it might change. So, I got much more interested in learner autonomy from as investigating motivation. And then I moved to work at a university in Kumamoto, Sojo University, which had a self-access learning center. And the goal was very much learner autonomy. And at that point, you start seeing a lot more complexity, right? Because the institution's goal is autonomy, there's a lot more focus on it, right? So, so that was kind of what that move really pushed me towards the PhD that I did, looking at teacher negotiation of learner autonomy. So
it seems like you've worn a lot of hats there, and each of these has definitely it's been a step on that journey. So you've obviously got this interdisciplinary thing going on with the science and chemistry background, and then the English teaching, and then slowly being exposed to autonomy over time, through the self-access center you mentioned.
So personally, I've always had an interest in languages. I wasn't allowed to take French A level because I wanted to do chemistry, math, further math, special math, and French. And they were just like, you can do physics. It's like, okay. Okay, have some general studies then as well. So, and at university I took Russian as a minor subject as well.
Okay.
So, and I did a few years of that. So, I've always had an interest in language and learning, and I can, from my own experience, it's like, you have to fit into the category the school thinks of, right? And
unless they're drafting someone for the suddenly opened up French position.
Well, they had a French teacher and they had a French class, but the problem was that the scheduling. It didn't. I was taking all the math I probably could, and that didn't work with the French. So, structural reasons, right? So
it seems that you've been able to follow your interests then eventually, and it's your autonomy, right? You've been able to develop that on your own in various ways.
I think it's understanding my own autonomy has helped me recognize it in others.
Okay, that's what I was getting at. So is that your message for someone that's going to be starting out, or towards your learners that you teach now, is kind of find that own pathway, that own interest into what you're doing?
Yes, I think so, because I mentioned I started off in motivation, and a lot of people were studying motivation, a lot of people still are, but at the time I started my master's degree, it was a big thing. But by the time I started my PhD, things had moved on, right? And I think the kind of message I would have is kind of try and persevere and find something you're really passionate about. Right? Like it's difficult to find something that you're both passionate about and good at, right? A lot of people are very passionate about their dream, but if we're honest, they're probably not going to make it because only maybe 1 or 2 people in the world become a Taylor Swift or something, and a lot of people find comfort in just doing something they're good at. There's a lot to be said for having just an average life where you're doing your job well and you're enjoying a normal everyday life. It's that's fine. But if you can find something that you're both good at and passionate about and good at, that's the really enjoyable part in life.
The center of the Venn diagram.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't know, unfortunately, teaching is not the most financially viable career. I've got lots of friends who, Imperial College, imposter syndrome. I've got friends who are working at very big companies, earning huge amounts of money, and I'm thinking, okay, yeah. So you have to be, I think, particularly for teaching, you have to be passionate about it. If you're not passionate about teaching, you probably should be doing something else.
Right. Sure.
A lot of the challenges I've faced as a teacher and now as somebody who's managing part-time teachers is encountering a teacher who is not passionate about teaching and not good at it. Which is a danger, I think, with Japan, I'll be honest, because whatever native category you fit into, you tend to get pigeonholed in that category, right? And there was no chance of me being a chemistry teacher in Japan.
Right.
So,
yeah. But certainly with content-based instruction, right? It sounds like you're currently working at a medical university. Is there some scope for exploring that?
Yeah, although actually, it's talking to people is the main thing. I think this is probably true of doctors everywhere, is they're not good at talking to people. In some ways, that's a self-preservation, because if you had a lot of empathy with the person you're performing surgery on, it's not necessarily going to help to help you focus on what is necessary to get done.
Yeah.
However, Japanese doctors in particular are pretty bad at talking to patients, even in Japanese. So my experiences have been eye-opening. So a lot of it
building into that tapestry that makes up your experience as a
exactly.
teacher, now a teacher leader, teacher trainer, right?
I realized that a degree in chemistry is a wonderful training of how to communicate in English in the third person and the passive voice. So it's I could have written my whole PhD in the passive voice, but I think I would have failed horribly.
So you mentioned your PhD there.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
The theme was broadly autonomy, right?
Yeah. So teacher negotiation of learner autonomy.
Okay.
So I did about 77 semi-structured interviews with teachers and students across a dozen universities in Japan. And really the key kind of theme that came out was that the teacher's orientation towards the institutional goals of learner autonomy and the means available affected how they negotiated learner autonomy or student learner autonomy. So some teachers maybe would work in, like, for example, like Sojo University was a university where I worked. Other universities with a self-access learning center or somewhere like that, and they would be a facilitator, and they would have very positive attitudes towards the goals, positive attitudes towards the means available to do it. Whereas a part-time teacher working in a university where learner autonomy is not really an institutional goal, or it is an institutional goal, but it's kind of very superficial, would have a very different attitude. And the teachers' own identity work tended to influence their attitude towards learner autonomy, and also how the students valued autonomy within the classroom. And the students in Japan you have this idea of like the public face and the true self, right? So tatemae and honne, right? And what came out in the interviews is the students are very adept at Japanese universities are very adept at presenting the image they think the teacher wants. Often to reduce their engagement with the material, but often it's just so they can get a better mark. So some English majors, for example, I think there were American and British studies majors in the interviews said that they did their English classes for the grades, but then on the weekends they went to an eikaiwa to study English, to learn to speak, which is a little bit bizarre, right? You would imagine.
And eikaiwa, just for anyone that's not familiar listening, it's a private language school.
Yeah, so a private language school, I'm sorry. It seems a bit weird. You're studying a subject, subject's focused on English and English-based cultures in English. A lot of these lectures were in English, and yet the students didn't think it was legitimate to pursue their own autonomy within the class. Right? And in some ways, you can also see this in the way that autonomy is presented in Japanese. So in Japanese, they would talk about jiritsu gakushu, right? And unfortunately, there's two words, jiritsu gakushu and jiritsu gakushu, right? So jiritsu gakushu with a different kanji character meaning learner autonomy, and jiritsu gakushu meaning something self-study directed by teacher. And as my PhD moved, the way it was presented shifted as well. So in the literature now, the Japanese literature, you'll see learner autonomy in katakana. They've shifted away from this Japanese, which kind of has two effects. One is that maybe there's a little bit of separation from the self-study, but also there's a kind of a rarefication, like they're bringing it up to something different, something other. Maybe
so it's like the level of a research concept, like a solidified thing.
It's not a legitimate research subject in Japan unless it has its own acronym, right? So it suddenly becomes LA in a lot of papers, right? So I think I interviewing a lot of the Japanese teachers, lots of them are not that comfortable with the idea, and it's beyond their experience as a student, and it's beyond their teacher training that they had. So some of them will they just enforce their class and they go ahead and they do what they want. Learner autonomy is not part of it. Others are just like, I don't care. I'm just here. This is just a part-time, I'm here from 9 and 8:50 when my first class is, and then my lunch break, and then I go to my next school in the afternoon, right? So, yeah, I think coming back to the PhD, I was using I think you've talked about this as well, like the epistemology of learner autonomy, like the knowledge, knowing about the learner autonomy. And the teachers would say, oh yes, I know learner autonomy. Learner autonomy is, and they give me the definition by Holek, right? The capacity to take responsibility for their own learning. Because everybody has read page 3 of that book, right? But then they would reshape it and change it. Some of them would say, well, that's the definition in the literature, but this is what I have. And so in my PhD, what I've explored is kind of the how the teachers are kind of controlling that definition of learner autonomy within their specific social field of the classroom.
Yeah, this is something I wanted to ask you about, is kind of localization, I guess you would call it. So, we've got this concept, but how is it adapted to the local context? Like by particular teachers, by particular schools, organizations, learners themselves, cultures even.
You're not a big fan of onion models, right? But ecology, like I used Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. So you've got different layers, right? Your teachers are working within institutional structures, but the institutional structures are influenced by mixed and national level kind of things. So there's reinterpretations as we're going down, right?
And I should also just as an addendum there, notice MEXT is an acronym which means the Japanese Ministry of Education as well. It's talking about a kind of an organizational, like supra level policy, educational policy level filtering that.
Yeah, it's quite complicated in its influences because of national universities are kind of pseudo independent. They're not entirely independent. Prefectural universities are again or controlled by local government rather than national government, and private universities want to make money. So there's always these kind of pressures going on. And so things like active learning, a policy from MEXT, influenced a lot of learner autonomy in things like self-access centers, but also how the universities wanted teaching to be implemented. And of course, then the professors, usually the tenured professors at the top of the universities, reinterpret it to reduce change in a lot of places, to kind of say, well, we were doing this already. And then it filters down to the teachers who in their classrooms are, and this was kind of the focus of the PhD, was how the teachers are reinterpreting that for their classrooms themselves. And you would see effectively the classroom is a different social field. So I was using things about ideas from Bourdieu about field and capital, and also habitus. So this idea that everybody has a kind of evolving set of dispositions for deciding things, right? So teachers are influenced by their own habitus when it comes to learner autonomy, so their own experiences, their own interpretations of what the university wants, their interpretations of what the students are going to do or not do, or how they perform in the class. So this learner autonomy is constantly being reinterpreted. And a student who might not demonstrate learner autonomy in this class will move to a next class which will have a different teacher, a different set of values. In the field, those kind of rules of the field have changed, so their behavior changes too. So in a way, I make the argument that I can't, from my evidence, I can't say that it's not a capacity, but I think that is a bit of a deficit model. You know, it's a lot of the early literature is about, this is the learner's responsibility, this is the learner's mental cognitive capacity. And you saw in a lot of the testing instruments, it was focused very much on the cognitive psychology of the learner. Whereas I would make the argument that at that point, at the age the students are and the level of just physical development, that they have the capacity, but they also have the capacity to choose not to use it. Right. A story I actually opened my PhD with is a class that I saw, a very prestigious high school in Japan, private high school, and their students were having huge problems. And we came in for one of these like study groups where there's like 30 teachers in the room and they're watching a class. And we had a break, and I kind of thought, okay, we've got like about another class period before the next observation of an English class, and the social studies class had an observation. I went into social studies, same, there's a teacher at the front, the room is lined with social studies teacher. He's doing the Senkoku Jidai area, so the warring states period. You know, there's ninja, there's samurai. He's really enthusiastic at the front. All the students are sat in their immaculate uniforms with the textbook propped open, and every single student was on a different page from the teacher. And none of the teachers around the room had noticed, right? They're all focused on this teacher. And it's like, yeah, these students have autonomy, and they're using their autonomy at this moment to disengage, but also protest, right? That this is not their normal class. This is the show class that the teacher is putting on. And that says quite a lot, you know, that a very expensive, very prestigious private high school in Japan with very, you know, with a very good reputation, and these students are actually protesting about their lack of involvement and engagement of the class. So, yeah, I think that those kind of insights, I guess, were really kind of make me question this idea that learner autonomy is only a cognitive capacity. You know, if we were talking about if we were talking about young children who are still undergoing cognitive development, so you're talking about elementary school, the first few years of elementary school, you could make the argument that they haven't developed learner autonomy, because if you think about Piaget, like you know, the basis of most Western educational psychology, there are certain ages of cognitive development. Those young children are at an age where maybe they haven't developed autonomy, right? They're still going through that process. But when you're talking about junior high, high school, secondary school, university students, they have autonomy. They have that capacity. Whether they use it or access it, I think depends very much on their understanding of the social situation they find themselves in.
Mhm.
Right.
So what's your advice for a teacher?
I think
To avoid being the Warring States period sociology lecturer at the front and the disinterested class who are being performative.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember the students will always be performative, right? And everybody is almost always a bit performative, right? I think what it is you've got to try and get them to actually be doing things with the knowledge that you're giving. There are, if you're teaching purely content, there are approaches like legitimation coding theory, where there are ways of speaking and engaging with the audience in a lecture style, which are better at knowledge creation, right? We have to think about knowledge creation rather than just knowledge transfer. So if you're teaching on the language side of things, you can get people involved much more. So task-based learning or CLIL or a flipped classroom approach. All those kind of different, my advice would maybe to be have a look at making sure your pedagogic toolbox is very well stocked with different kind of items, because students at different classes and different students will have different needs and different different approaches to engaging with you as a teacher.
Yeah, perhaps also your interdisciplinary backgrounds, is also another way in which, that can be helpful for a teacher. And I just don't just pigeonhole yourself, right? So kind of explore those interests in other areas as well, and that can feed back into your classroom work.
I think, it helped. I think I've certainly, in my teaching, it's helped me that I've been a science teacher, that I've taught math classes as well and things like this, because you can see that this kind of approach might work here or that approach might work there, and you can kind of switch between them. And if something that happens a lot in Japan is people stick slavishly to a textbook, and the textbook was written by a teacher with a specific set of students in mind. And you are not that teacher, and you are not that, those are not your students. So I think you have to develop a range of skills to not only adapt the textbook for your class, but to be able to go beyond it, right? Textbooks should be a kind of a resource for the students, not really your teaching guide, right?
Yes.
So
it's almost as if it's a kind of a teacher autonomy development, thing. While
they go hand in hand, right? Like I think David Little said long time ago that you couldn't have learner autonomy without teacher autonomy.
Right, but they're not contingent upon one another. Are they solely? Like, can you have it's just on its own as a professional development goal, or is its worth in the eventual promotion
I don't know
of autonomy for the learner?
The thing is, like, to know that you've in terms of like professional development, to know that you've actually done something and you've developed professionally, you have to see it working. Right. So if you're working on a teacher autonomy, but you're not seeing any improvement in the learner autonomy, you've got to start asking questions there, right? It's there's something maybe we can talk a bit more about, is there's complexity, right? There are connections between these things. And if you're not seeing a strong connection between what you're doing in your professional development and what you're seeing in the class, then you have to start asking what else is going on. It might just be something simple, like you haven't presented it in the right way. Was it like 1960s and 70s? They talked about, Snyder talked about the hidden curriculum, and there are papers about hidden curriculum in Japan, and how some people understand that this signaling denotes this has value, this thing has value. So maybe the way you're presenting is not right, and that might be as simple as taking more of a coaching approach if your class has lots of baseball team members or American football players in it, right? Or it might be like I mentioned before, like you wrap up the physics in a skateboarder analogy, right? A lot of communication is that it's not sugarcoating, but the wrapping up, presenting of information, right?
Of course, the presentation of information is half the battle. Yeah.
So there's a lot of complexity going on there, and one reason for having that large pedagogic toolbox is so that you can, if your marvelous plan is not working, you pick out a different tool and just change it up, right? And you can kind of take a brute force approach, and just from day one, okay, we're doing task-based learning and you're making the students do everything, but it's going to be a lot of hard work. So you have to kind of I use the word in my PhD, negotiation, talk about teachers negotiating learner autonomy, and
probably negotiating the institutional constraints that are placed on them, right, as well.
So in a way, as a teacher, you're teaching is like the first job where you walk in and you're managing 30 people, right? It's the day one, you're managing a large number of people
in a consequential activity.
Exactly, right? So you've got to kind of go in and be willing to move around and negotiate a little bit. You also, particularly with most people, is you want to also make clear boundaries, right? So you can't just go in and be the student's friend. You can't go in and be the draconian. Well, you can, but you're not going to get much learner autonomy going in and being the hard taskmaster, right? So it's having aims and goals, but also having and red lines, but also being willing to negotiate around those.
Yeah, that's good. So I think all that advice is good for helping get across to your message that it's something that the individual teacher needs to define in their own specific context with that specific group of students.
Well,
that institution.
If a teacher's not comfortable with students taking responsibility for certain things, then it won't work, right? So you have to find somewhere where everybody is comfortable and happy to do things. And for people, this is actually maybe more important, is people at an institutional level have to start thinking about making sure that the teachers are able to negotiate, right? There's a lot of there's particularly in national school systems, there's a lot of you must, particularly in Japan, it's like here's your textbook, this large tome, and you must teach everything. Whereas in other schools, maybe they would say, school systems, okay, we're doing a kind of flipped version, you need to read this chapter and prepare, and we do the task. But Then I know one university in Japan, or one department in a university in Japan, where they give all the teachers mini iPad minis, and the iPad has a schedule on it. So every class at this time, you're supposed to do this, and at this time we're supposed to do that. And then written feedback has to be done at a particular schedule. And if you're good at teaching, but you're not passionate about it, that's a good job, because you don't have to think about it, right? It's very mechanical. It's almost like this Fordist mechanical conveyor belt of teaching. And I'll be honest, I don't think that is very helpful. If you've got that approach, you might as well just replace everybody with AI, right? People could go on an app and do it. You don't have to. You don't have to have that negotiation. The problem is that it doesn't necessarily transfer to the real world.
Right, of course. I'm glad that we went for over an hour without mentioning AI. No. I'm glad that the conversation has gone this long, but we haven't mentioned artificial intelligence and AI until now, which is a good thing.
The way I think about AI is there's lies, there's damn lies, there's statistics, and there's AI. Basically, AI is a statistical model at the end of the day, right? So the modeling data that goes in affects what comes out. And yes, if you have a huge amount of, you have this huge large language model going in, like ChatGPT and so on, then you'll get something out. If the data going in is good, you'll get something out. But they don't have the entirety of reality going in. We don't have the entirety of reality in our heads to program stuff. So, it's a kind of, at the moment, AI is a kind of money-saving panacea, right? Like AI can do this and AI can do that, so we don't need to hire this person, we don't need to hire that person. But it's, there are places for that. We've in society, a lot of things are automated, whether it's the smartphone you have, and lots of that automation is there, but it's not how people want to function, and it's not how society currently functions. And we have to be able to operate without complete data. And that's problem with AI is at the end of the day, if you've got bad data going in or insufficient data going in, you're not going to get much help.
And I think it goes back to your advice earlier to early career teachers, perhaps, or to people that are interested in this as a research topic, is to really get to know who you're in the room with as people, get to know more about the context, be adaptive, and don't just trust these preset answers.
I think Emma Ushioda wrote something about, you get to know people better over a glass of wine than in any other situation, right? I think it has its place, but again, it's just a tool, right? It's not in the end, it's not going to replace everything. What it does do, I think, is it puts more onus on teachers to be engaging with professional development and continuous professional development. Like I said, there's no point in you just slavishly teaching from the textbook, because they'll replace you with an online course, right? if you're teaching an irrelevant content in a mechanical way to students, you might as well do Duolingo, right? Or your preferred language app.
Sure.
So yeah, I think another way to think about it is good quality education is a bit like I don't know, a luxury watch. There's no reason why you couldn't replace it with a cheap quartz watch, but there's some quality to it, and there's a value to it, and it's maybe not a quality watch, maybe like a suit that's tailored, right? It fits you better. It's
Nice
more
analogy.
practical. Exactly.
I certainly hope some university administrators are listening to your comments.
I doubt it, because really a lot of administration is about making life easy, right? Whereas actually, I think people talk about moving out of your comfort zone, but a lot of administration is about putting things firmly back in your comfort zone. Mm-hmm. And when you look at education as a whole, that's actually a big source of inequality, right? Like these students come from this socioeconomic background, so they're going to be a manual laborer, or this thing. It makes administration is easy, right? If we want an equal society, we have to be very careful about making administration easy, right? It's kind of it's like the reductionist approach. You're trying to reduce things down to make it easy, but then you miss something, right?
Yes.
Or like the teachers who told me that the students aren't autonomous, right? They've missed the fact that the student is going to this ECHO, our private English school, at the weekend, right? So you've missed some potential there.
Sure.
So, and something my university is very keen on is getting students outside of the typical doctor pool, medical student pool. A lot of our students are third or fourth generation medical doctors, right, from that type of family. But then we've got mature students. We've got students who didn't go to high school. We've got students whose first time in university, first generation university entrance. So I think in a lot of ways we need to be thinking about progress rather than trying to rigidly control things.
Okay.
So
yeah, no, that's an important message.
Sorry,
I think that's something we're going to have to kind of push back against this tide of kind of streamlining everything, putting people into boxes, making life easier. Which is, the
tick boxes on a questionnaire, the Likert scales, it's like that is that that's kind of making it easier for the analysis and the administration that comes later.
Right. So I'm mindful of your time. I don't want to take up too much more, but if you were going to bullet point or highlight one kind of interesting direction that you think the field is going to go in from now, what's like the most kind of relevant thing that comes to mind for you?
I think I wrote a paper about complexity and about how, yes, it's kind of the direction we're going in. But as I said, we kind of have to moderate it a little bit because what happens a lot of time, particularly with, the things like talk about social turns and cognitive turns and positive psychology turns. And what happens a lot of the time is that the paradigm gets too narrow, and then you realize it's not working, so people then forget it or get rid of it or change the paradigm or shift. Whereas what we should be looking at is something more inclusive of different ideas. So something I'm hoping to have done this year is a book chapter on critical realism and learner autonomy. So again, going at the epistemology of learner autonomy, because that kind of epistemology of critical realism is much more holistic in its approach. So it's kind of a kind of meta structure, like how different ideas or competing ideas can be arranged together to give a fuller view, right? So, you know, again, coming from a scientific background, complexity is actually quite a scary topic, because you do your best and you do your best to quantify things and reduce things down so it's easy to control, but then something happens, right? You try to do different modeling and so on, but it's difficult. So I think the way things are going to shift, I think, is you're going to see, I hope we're going to see more of a combination of qualitative and quantitative approaches coming together. So more, not necessarily mixed methods, but something that has that viewpoint where you can supplement this quantitative approach with a qualitative approach, or you can supplement these insights with this statistical data, right? So I think a more holistic view and complex view of learner autonomy is where things are moving. And I think that's true of language learning in it as a whole, because quantitative stuff is very, very powerful, right? AI is very, very powerful. However, there are also some very useful insights that you can get from qualitative work, right? So, and teachers' experiences don't always match what the statistical outcomes and so on, right? So I think, yeah, this kind of bringing together is I'm hoping is going to come about, because it avoids that reductionism, that kind of narrowing, and it allows for more room for progress and dealing with inequalities. You know, English in Japan can be a wonderful tool for overcoming inequity. You know, it's a question of if students can access it. You know, you think about I think about the students at medical school. Yes, they're all going to be doctors, hopefully, probably, if they study hard enough. But the ones who will be able to have the choice to do research or develop their career at a national or international level will be the ones who have those English skills, because English is the lingua franca of medicine, right? So, or at the moment is, right? So, yeah, I think that's where it's going to move, is this more holistic look at things. I realize that's a bit scary, because that asks the question of the teachers of what do you think of the institution and the power structures they are in themselves, right? So that's a difficult thing, but I hope that's where I'm going.
Okay. Well, while we're waiting with anticipation for that book chapter, I'll be sure to link to your article from the end of last year, which was in the Learner Development Journal, which you know, touches on some of those topics like the research epistemology and complexity, right, as well as kind of maybe a kind of to someone can whet their appetite there, kind of touch on some of those topics. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time. This is a really interesting conversation. You've been very generous with your time, and I appreciate it.
Maybe too generous, I'm sorry.
No, not at all. It's fascinating. All right, Dominic Edsall, thank you very much.
No, thank you.